Hello, and welcome to Character Class. Today I'd like to talk to you about world building. I've got 5 little tips for you out there who like to do world building, like myself, like to get into the nitty gritty, the meat and potatoes, as it were. Uh, and I thought I'd share them all with you. Just some things, some loose little guidelines that I like to do. And when I say world building, I don't mean just drawing a map, but I'll get into that. That's one of the tips, actually. So let's jump right into it for world building. Um, Tip number 5, feel free to borrow from other worlds, but don't steal. What I mean by that is you want to borrow. If you do, some people just like making everything up, but it's usually easier to borrow a few things. Be like, well, I kind of like how this particular group operates in this story that I really like, so I'm going to kind of put them in my world. Uh, but transplanting things directly usually doesn't work. Uh, so it's always a good idea to, when you're borrowing, to tweak things, make it yours, adjust them just enough to be able to make them not only fit smoothly into your world that you're creating, but also to make sure that anybody that may be familiar with the source material isn't going to know exactly what's coming. So you feel free to borrow, but make it yours. Uh, Tip number 4, this is what I was mentioning I was going to get back into. When you're world building, you're not just building a world. There's more to it than that. Not just the world itself. That's part of it. Crafting a map uh, and whatnot. That's always part of it. But there's other things. There's people. There's history, events, races that are in there. Now, if you're doing it like, for example, with the World of Darkness, the World of Darkness is basically our world. So you can use real world locations. Uh, Again, it's our world, so you don't need to worry about races in terms of elves and gnomes and tieflings and all that. Uh, it's not something you need to worry about. But there are other races, uh, as they say, with racism. There are other races that can be populated. So it's always good to do research in that regard. I will always advocate doing research. It's one of the things I'm like, yes, what? We're supposed to be role playing, not doing homework. Oh, that's part of the fun is crafting these worlds. As a DM and a storyteller, it's something I really like. But you've also got the history of the world that you're making. Um, Even if it is the real world, well, you can change history. You can alter subtle things here and there if you want. It's your world. Go nuts. But you need to keep that in mind when you're making it because you want to be able to have uh, a multitude of things that you can pull from. And having these things written down, even if they're just little notes that you've scribbled down about, the people in this area are like this usually. Uh, this particular area has a history of missing people going on. Um, these dwarves don't like outsiders in this particular mountain chain. There's all kinds of little things you want to keep in mind when you're doing your world building because everything all meshes together like gears interlocking in a wonderful system. Uh, Number 3, my third tip, is that you want to detail your universal forces. Now, what I mean by those is there are always things, elements in any world that will affect the characters and things that the characters can affect. These can be anything as simple as like an actual township or an army or anything simple and mundane like that, like the economy of a region. That's something to keep in mind because what happens if the players, if you're playing in a fantasy setting, come back from this treasure dungeon? loaded for bear with 3 wagons full of gold and or 3 wagons full of valuable objects and hit the city and sell them all. Well, then there's a deficit of money in that city because it's all in the players. You got to keep your eye on these things. You make sure that they're. You don't need to have like great details, but it's always a good idea to keep them in mind. Also, things like the magic system that your world is using, if they are using any, or psionics, if that's being used, um, as well as weather. What's the weather like in this particular region? Because that can always come into play. Uh, as well as the gods, if you have any gods, or other supernatural powerful entities that are roaming the world, demigods, celestials, demons, fairies, even. Uh, there's a multitude of things that could be in there, and you need to keep your eye on that as a storyteller, as a dungeon master, as somebody who's building the world. That's something to keep in mind. Uh, number two. Number two is that you want to make sure things fit the world that you're making. When you're building a world, it's even just crafting a map. You got to keep an eye on things. Um, if you're not sure how to build maps, it's one of them things. Look to real world maps. See how the real world is in terms of the placement of deserts and mountains and so on and so forth. Keep an eye on these things. Now, the world that I've started to make, I've got a little bit of a stream video that I put up on my channel here. Uh, you can find that. It's in character class, building world, I believe I called it. Uh, I'll probably put a link down in the description below if you wanted to actually go and look at it. But in that one, that particular world is very chaotic in how it's put together. It's been ravaged for thousands of years by chaos. Things are strange. Things don't make sense. So in that world, I will have things butting up against other things that probably aren't natural, but it's not supposed to be. Now, if you're making a world that's more natural, it's a good idea to keep in mind that. Same as for when you're filling it with your people, when you're doing your history and your races and whatnot. Keep an eye on what the world is like in general as you're putting these things in. You may have to cut things. I mean, having a super advanced technology in a world of, or a super advanced technological race in a world of swords and sorcery doesn't fit. So you need to keep that in mind as you're doing it. Same with the gods and whatnot. Do you want to put a god in that's not really going to fit things? Um, Something to keep in mind as you're doing it. And the number one tip that I have for world building is to not be afraid to change things. Don't be afraid to do that. And that could be during your building phase. That could be after you've finished and you suddenly realize that you made a mistake. Uh, don't be afraid to change then. And don't be afraid to change in the middle of a campaign that you're running. Just because the players have done something or the players have an idea of how things go and you get this thought, yeah, I could do that, but I've already got this set down. Nope, no you don't. It's not set in stone. Even if even if the players have already encountered something and you think it is set in stone, take 5 minutes and think about it. You might come up with a way to be able to reverse that decision, uh, pull a twist ending on them, so to speak, and reverse things. Uh, they thought it was this, but no, it's not. It's actually this. Uh, they thought that this area was inhospitable, but no, it's not. It secretly is a bountiful utopian area. You could do all kinds of cool things with it. Uh, but if you are afraid to change, if you want to keep that locked down just because you've done all this work into it, then you're missing out on opportunities that can be done. Uh, and another thing to do, kind of a corollary to don't be afraid to change things, is don't be afraid to get input from your other players. Uh, Talk to them about things. If you want to see what they think about the world, get their opinions. So those are my 5 little tips. Simple little things, vague as heck, I know, but very simple on world building. Uh, as always, if you like what I'm doing, please give that like button a tap. Give that subscribe button a tap as well if you haven't already, and ring the bell to be kept apprised of when I put out new videos. Uh, and throw a comment in the comment section. What are your tips on world building? What do you usually do when you build a world? How detailed do you get in it? Throw those comments in the comment section. I would love to get a discussion going with some people. And I will see you. You all take care. And I'll see you next time on Character Clash.